Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Hongying Wang on China's role in global governance. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Each week, I'm very happy to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo to talk about some important aspect of global governance or international public policy. This week, my guest is my colleague, Hongying Wang, visiting Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a noted expert on China and China's role in global governance. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Just for our audience, let's talk a bit in general terms about the current state of play and China's role in global governance. We all know that China is a growing power, has been a fast-growing power for a long time, a signature member of the BRICS group of companies, the emerging economies that have exhibited the strongest growth rates in recent years. But what exactly is China's role now in global governance? How would you characterize it?
Oh, I would say China is an under-participant in global governance. If you look at China's contribution to major global governance initiatives, financially, in terms of personnel, in terms of ideas, programs, it is ranked much lower than you would expect. China is the second largest economy, is a major trading power in the world and major military and political power. In many ways, one would expect China to play a very prominent role, but if you look at its actual behavior, China has been actually keeping a pretty low profile. It doesn't participate nearly as actively, for example, as another BRIC country, Brazil. It doesn't participate as much as its neighbor, Japan, especially in terms of financial contributions, even controlling for GDP per capita, the wealth factor. And certainly since we're in Canada, China falls way behind Canada as a middle power in its contribution to various areas of global governance. So I would say China is under-participating. Yeah.
Now, China has had a seat at the United Nations now for a very long time, once it finally wrested it away from Taiwan. Right. So it's been a key player in at least one pivotal global governance organ. It wasn't a member of the G7 or G8, but now the G20 is taking on more and more of the functions that the G7 and G8 used to take, and China is a member of the G20. So how much of this is simply a function of the fact that China is relatively late in the game getting into at least some of the relevant groups that do take responsibility for leading global governance?
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly a factor. If you want to explain why China seems to be underplaying its role, the short history, relatively speaking, short history of China's involvement is a factor. But if you ask diplomats, I'm sure you interact with them all the time, the level of sophistication on the part of China's diplomats, for example, statesmen, is actually quite high. So if you're thinking, oh, maybe this is a new country not experienced enough, not knowing the rules, I don't think that's true anymore. It might have been the case in the 1990s, but China has been around long enough, certainly compared to Brazil and some of the emerging countries, and it certainly has the capability. I think for China, the issue is more, it doesn't exactly know itself how much of a role, what kind of a role, what China would stand for. One reason is China's multiple identities, right? China has traditionally portrayed itself to be part of the third world developing country. Now it's increasingly part of the larger powers. And how does China position itself on important trade issues and intellectual property rights issues and so on? It's no longer that simple. So that's one reason, in addition to the length factor you mentioned. And the other is China's extremely complicated domestic politics. It really puts a lot of constraints on China's interest and capability of greater involvement in global governance.
I would like to ask you more about that in a minute, but I also wanted to ask you whether there's an issue here with China not thinking of itself as a global player traditionally. I mean, I speak to colleagues who study China more closely than I do, and many of them say, if you look back at the broad sweep of Chinese history, China is a civilization that's been very focused geographically on East Asia. It's always thought of itself as a regional player. It had tributary states relating to it, so it was sort of semi-hegemonic for hundreds and hundreds of years, but never really thought of itself as a global player. Is that still true? Are they still primarily defining themselves as interested in regional governance as opposed to global governance?
I think that's a very good point. I think traditionally China's interest and its expertise has been within the region, but I think in recent years the Chinese ambition has far exceeded that. If you look at China's discourse on China's position in the world, it usually looks at the U.S. as the comparable power, not so much Japan. What can we do to be maybe a successor of the U.S., if not a successor, one of the partners of a multilateral, multipolar world. So I think traditionally, regional focus was very much characteristic of Chinese diplomacy, but increasingly, I think at least the ambition, maybe not the reality, of China's final place in the world is at the global level.
And is its underperformance in global governance a function at all of other countries' resistance to the idea of China playing a larger role?
Very much so. I think despite all the rhetoric we hear, China should take on more responsibility, the G2, first proposed by some policymakers in Washington. Overall, I would say Western industrialized countries and even some of China's neighbors are very dubious about really the prospect of China playing a bigger role. It's ideologically different, culturally, in terms of values, not so much socialized yet in the prevailing international norms. So from a Western point of view, it's kind of a very uncertain prospect. How eager are they really in welcoming China into a bigger role is highly questionable.
Very good. Well, we'll be back again in a minute with Hongying Wang to talk about China's role in global governance. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's talk about the domestic politics, which I think boggle everyone's mind in North America who try to pay attention to it. Very complicated country from a domestic political point of view, and I'm sure we don't know enough to understand it. But you've been studying this very closely. So how would you characterize some of the main dynamics, some of the main forces, issues, players in Chinese domestic politics that actually constrain China's global governance role?
Well, I think that maybe there are two dimensions. One is the constraint in terms of China's interest, how much energy and interest China's leadership can devote to global governance issues because of its various domestic preoccupations. And the other is China's capability in participating, contributing, especially ideas to global governance. So let's maybe start with the interest aspect. The leadership of China is very interested in having international prestige in one way that bolsters the legitimacy of the regime. But on the other hand, the more pressing challenge for its legitimacy comes from all kinds of domestic problems. So the environmental degradation, which increasingly is a source of public protest in China, the rising inequality not only between regions, the coastal versus inland, but also different socioeconomic groups. There are people who do very well, extremely wealthy, but there are lots of people still left behind in China. So, and then official corruption, it's a huge issue. So you can name any number of issues that create sources of political instability. The mass incidents, so to speak, numbers in the tens of thousands, if not more. So if you put yourself in leadership's shoes, how much time do I have 24 hours a day to think about what China's role might be in the world? I need to keep the domestic front under control. So that, in a way, constrains the leadership's just ability to participate and their interest. They're primarily interested in keeping China itself in order at home and the regime safe, so to speak, from political instability. Then on the other side of the coin is the limited capability of the Chinese society as a whole to participate as, let's say, the Brazilian civil society, the Canadian civil society, because when we talk about global governance, we aren't just talking about intergovernmental organizations, right? So at these international fora where many women's groups, environmental groups, whatever, children's rights groups, they come together, they put forth ideas, share their practices. What can the Chinese contribute? Very little. The civil society in China is so weak, and they're so unable to express alternative views and opinions from the government. So that aspect of global governance is just an area China has simply no capacity, I would say, to contribute to. So those are at least, two aspects why domestic dynamics makes China such a weak and low participant.
Now you talked about the legitimacy of the regime and concerns about it domestically. How would you characterize the legitimacy of the regime? Is it generally considered a legitimate regime? And if so, why? If not, why not?
It's amazing that it has survived this long, right? The fall of the Soviet communist regime led some people to say, oh, maybe China will be next. But amazingly, it has been, so to speak, legitimate long enough to survive until this day. But I think that is changing, and changing very fast. I think historically, the CCP's legitimacy rested on nationalism. This was the party that liberated China from imperialism, ended China's 100 years of humiliation and whatnot. Well, that lasted a while and still resonates, I think, with some part of the population today. But in recent years, the biggest source of legitimacy is its ability to deliver economic performance. So China has done so well. Well, maybe we're not legitimately elected, but we have done the job well. So I think that has played a big role in maintaining some level of legitimacy. But imagine an economic crisis of some sort, which is even China is not immune to. When that happens, what happens? All the other sources of legitimacy that other governments perhaps enjoy practically don't exist in China. So when this one pillar falls, it's very likely that China would be thrown into some kind of political turmoil. The legitimacy issue is really serious. And I'll just tell you how the government officials themselves see this. There are multiple government officials who report that they have to wear some kind of a mechanism that would alert them anytime there's any kind of mishap. Could be 3 people gathering in a public square. They have to react right away. What kind of a party is this? This is a party on constant alert 24/7. And so that tells you something about the party's own perception of its legitimacy. Very
One thing
fragile.
we do read about here in terms of Chinese domestic politics are separatist threats. How serious are separatist threats in China, and how much do those preoccupy the regime?
Very, very serious threats to the regime. So in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, in Tibet, recent days we've seen more and more Tibetan, religious or non-religious people, extreme reaction to the Chinese regime, setting themselves on fire. One has to be desperate to do something like that. And so I guess since the late 90s, the Chinese government has launched this project of economic development for the Western regions. It's not because those regions are the poorest. They are poor, but there are other regions in China that would have benefited from the economic programs the government designed. The government distributed money, resources there primarily because of this worry of separatism. They wanted to at least deliver some economic goodies so these ethnic minorities in the western, southwestern, northwestern part of China would perhaps be more compliant with the regime. But that in itself tells you that this is a threat the government has tried very hard to deal with.
But usually these sort of control-oriented responses tend to backfire historically. They tend to weaken legitimacy of the regime over time. It doesn't sound as though there's any acknowledgement of that, or at least very little in Beijing. There was back in the day, right, when the one-child policy was instituted. Some of the ethnic minorities were actually exempted.
Yeah,
or given
they still are.
treatment.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be some sort of soft power nod towards the inclusiveness of Chinese society. But now when we see self-immolations happening in Tibet, very quick crackdown, right? People are immediately arrested who've been witnessing these. Their cell phones are confiscated so that no videos can get out. It's a very in-your-face kind of repression of these expressions of discontent. That must surely be further weakening.
Yeah, I think the government has tried to use both the carrot and the stick. The carrot has been a lot of economic resources, building the highway and whatnot. Even that, of course, it's controversial. It's good for the economy, maybe, for some parts of the region, but it also dilutes the cultural cohesiveness and so on. So there's some of those maybe carrots combined with something else. And then definitely, recently you see a lot more use of the stick. And it's probably a sign that the grip is being undermined so much. I'm sure the government would not like to do that, especially because the Chinese government is very concerned about China's image, and all these things playing out in Western media is certainly no good. But they must be running out of other ways of dealing with these crises.
Fascinating. Well, we'll be back again in a moment with Hongying Wang. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So we've talked a bit about the domestic constraints on China's global governance role. Let's talk a bit about the international constraints. We've already said a little bit about some of the suspicions of other countries, and not necessarily entirely willing to let China play much more of a global governance role. And yet, on the other hand, there's a sense, you may agree, that a lot of countries are beginning to look at China, its economic weight, its increasing technical and human capacity, and beginning to think, maybe these should be leveraged, maybe these should be used for the greater good in a more constructive way. And maybe one way of overcoming some of the fears of China's potentially negative international role would be to co-opt China into more of a responsible global governance role. So I imagine the outside world is a bit torn as to whether they do or do not want China.
How much?
So who are some of the relevant players here, and how are they leaning? And on balance, do you think China could play more of a global governance role than it's doing, given the permissiveness or constraints of the international context?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously, the big powers, the US, the European Union, Japan, China's Asian neighbors are very relevant to this issue, and I guess the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, and so on. International organizations also are very relevant actors. I'd say, well, let's start with the US. The US would like China to make more of a contribution in especially the rebalancing of the global financial system, right? China has accumulated so much foreign currency reserves as the biggest creditor for the US. So certainly the US would like to see China play more of a role as a consumer in the global economy and balancing the global financial system. But the US probably, for various reasons, of course the US itself is divided. Some are more willing to see China play a bigger role, but some are really suspicious of what China might use when it has a bigger voice, more of a voting power in various organizations. And militarily, this is perhaps on the horizon. The only potential enemy the US faces, I guess, aside from Al-Qaeda and the war on terror. So I think the US has reasons to want China to play a bigger role in the financial sector in addressing the financial imbalance, but not so much on other issues. I guess the European Union seems to be less preoccupied with the potentially military threat from China, and sees China more as an economic opportunity as well as a challenger. So I think the majority probably are more open to a bigger role for China. And then China's own Asian neighbors, well, Japan is a case where history never dies and seems to continue to complicate current relations between the two countries. And then you have countries in Southeast Asia that are immediately next to China, and for them, China's power is both an enormous blessing because of the market. They depend so much on China for economic development, market, and so on. But they also live right next to this giant, the South China Sea, being an obvious source of potential conflict between them and China and the issue of Taiwan, right? So these people have both reasons to want China to do better as a potential economic partner for them, but also always wary what military and political implications might be of such a huge neighbor in the region. So that's why they probably all would like to see a continued presence of the US and maybe outside powers in general to balance China's potential threat to their security and what other issues.
Yeah. How much of a constraint is the fact that China's been relatively slow integrating into the global economy, relatively latecomer to the trade regime, progress but not complete progress yet on intellectual property rights and investment terms and conditions, and so far no sign of a move towards a floating exchange rate.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really complicated question. I understand what you're saying from an outsider's point of view. Look at China is so slow. Why hasn't it done more? But I think increasingly China's policymakers as well as intellectuals are raising the opposite question. And what they're saying is perhaps understandably, the post keeps moving. It used to be if we just pass laws about intellectual property rights, we have made progress. Well, we did, and we've joined all kinds of intellectual property rights regimes, but the implementation hasn't been great. Now we're not measured on the first at all, we're just measured on implementation. So we always fall short. So I think from a Chinese point of view, you can understand there's a certain level of frustration of this lack of recognition of how much China has already done, moving toward these moving targets. So in terms of the exchange rate, well, China's currency has appreciated, I think 20-25% over the last few years. It used to be 8.4 to a dollar, now it's 6.7 or something like that. So it's not as fast, perhaps, as the world would like to see, but I think it is important also to give credit to the Chinese, both the government and the people, for what they have already done. It's a slow process of mutual accommodation. It can't just be, it's our target and you keep moving and we keep pulling it away from you. That just gets very, very difficult for both sides.
And it does seem as though certain parts of China are actually very well plugged into the global economy, and other parts not so much. So Hong Kong, Shanghai, very well integrated in the global economy. Is the constraint here also that China's not really a unitary actor from a global economic perspective?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I think that's a really good point. There's a China on the coast, and there's a China in the middle, and there's a China in the western part. So I think if you're a business company going to China investing, if you're in Shanghai, you're probably quite comfortable. If you go to Chongqing or someplace else inland, it is almost like a different country. Yeah, so things do vary from region to region.
Very much.
Yeah.
We'll be back again in a moment with Hongying Wang. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So in our last segment, I'd like to ask you to gaze into your crystal ball and cast your mind forward 10, 20 years and tell us what you think might happen. Where is China going? Is it going in a direction that's going to give it a bigger role in global governance or further diminish its role in global governance? What are some of the main trends, issues, threats, opportunities that you see as somebody who watches China closely?
If only I had a crystal ball, I would look through it. Well, I think what we have witnessed in the last few weeks with this incident related to Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing, who has made a career on his very charismatic political leadership style, as well as probably ruthless crackdown of his opponents, and this sort of nostalgia for the Cultural Revolution period. He has been removed from his position, and probably his supporters in the next weeks and months will be losing power as well, in just ahead of the 18th Party Congress. But this, I think, is an indicator of the increasing division within the Chinese Communist Party, both for ideological reasons and for reasons of personal power, political ambitions. So that, I think, will play a very big role in shaping the near-term future of China politically. It is perhaps the first time I can think of in 20 years or so, such public split has happened within the leadership. But if this is indicative of a larger trend, one can imagine some sort of a factional model of intra-party relationship. So the party itself may stay, but it may become a political entity that is internally divided, and different groups, different factions have to compromise a lot more than before, and they may have some kind of a political arrangement where one faction might take power for a period of time, another faction for another period of time. So it's sort of reminiscent of a Japanese model of an earlier time, although it would be much less democratic given the larger political system. So that's one aspect of future development. Another thing, as I said before, if there is an economic crisis, many things that are time bombs in the Chinese economic system, social system, could explode. And then that becomes a much bigger transformation than the leadership elite struggle. So
and an economic crisis in China is something like the annual growth rate drops from 7% to 5%, right?
Yes, yeah.
Whereas for us, 5% would be a miracle year.
Sounds good, yeah. But for China, because of the population, the unemployment issue, half the college graduates do not find jobs in 2 or 3 years. So without a 7% and above growth rate, the unemployment issue just becomes unmanageable. That's why the imperative, no matter what happens, the 7% has to be met.
But
so
that can't go on indefinitely.
Exactly, as you say. So if it becomes 5%, 4%, the leadership will have serious problems to deal with. And Chinese society, all the other issues people are willing to put aside because at least they're doing okay economically, are going to become much more salient. Then you have a convergence of many things that don't go the way they should go. It could be a total crisis. So let's hope that's not the scenario.
What about democratization? It's been more than 20 years since Tiananmen Square. And I remember that well. I remember thinking, okay, this just means that before long there will be serious democratization, and I've been wrong now for more than 20 years.
Well,
is it still a distant hope?
I guess one thing is, what is democracy in a Chinese context? It's really difficult to say. There certainly have been many steps toward political liberalization. If you look at the netizens, what people are able to debate and what they're able to participate in their own way. So if democratization is a process, I would say it has already happened. It has happened very slowly, but it has happened in the last 10, 20 years. But is there an end point when we suddenly declare China has arrived? It's now a democracy. That's very difficult to say.
Is competitive multi-party democracy out of the question?
That's not something I see on the horizon, for the simple reason that the Communist Party has been so successful in cracking down on any form of political organization, whether it's Falun Gong or any alternative political parties, religious, any kind of organization. 3 people gathering on a square is not tolerated. So people may be very unhappy, but they're individuals. They are not able so far to organize in any way. So actually, one scholar pointed out this very interesting phenomenon. We always count these thousands and thousands of mass protests as if they're a sign of the Communist Party's weakness, and they are, in a way. But on the other hand, the enormous number also suggests they're not able to gather their forces together. There is not one effective opposition, or 2 or 3. There are thousands and thousands. These are all very small scale things that the party can actually suppress relatively easily. So if you're thinking about multi-party competition, the problem is, what's the alternative organization? The party itself may be rotten, the Communist Party, but what is the alternative? So I think that's something that's not immediately clear to me.
But it could, in principle, grow organically, right? I mean, now that relations with Taiwan are better, there's much more in the way of cross-strait traffic and contact, and one would imagine, at least on the coast of the People's Republic, people are now more aware of the Taiwanese system, which is actually a very highly functioning competitive multi-party democracy. Would that not sort of encourage wistful thinking, or
I think people
borrow ideas?
Yeah, I think people, especially the intellectuals who are more liberally oriented, look at Taiwan as a potential example, a model for China to emulate. But the problem is the Communist Party also is extremely aware of the danger of alternative political organization. So far it hasn't done what the KMT did in the late 1980s, which is to open the system to multiple parties. As long as the Communist Party keeps that its policy, it's just really difficult. What might happen is a total collapse of the system without a coherent alternative there to step in and take the country to its next stage of political development. I think in that scenario, a lot of people will lose. It's not just the Communist Party.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming in and sharing your obviously wide expertise on China with us. I've learned a lot, and I hope my audience will agree that they have as well. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.